Today we are considering another of the Kingdom of Heaven parables, stories that Jesus told to help us understand more about God's kingdom. In our series this summer, we have already considered a few of these. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, like a pearl, and as we considered last week, like yeast. Today, we are comparing the kingdom of heaven with a landowner, his workers, and the wage he pays them. Most parables seem to have a title that people have come to associate with them, and this one is no different. It is often called the laborers in the vineyard. But the difficulty with titles is that they give us an automatic slant, which we place upon the parable. Calling it the laborers in the vineyard ignores the landowner, a prominent figure in the story. It also ignores the wage. What if we were to call this story the considerate boss, or the grouchy workers, or even, as Amy Jill Levine poses, the surprising salaries? We might pay attention differently. As with the other parables we have explored, we can't understand this parable without looking at each of these characters. The first character we encounter is the landowner, or the homeowner, or head of house, if you want to be closer to the Greek. Matthew tells us that the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. This is not an unusual beginning to the day for a landowner in the first century. As Barclay points out, the Jewish day began around 6 a.m., and the marketplace was a place where men would come with their tools and wait for someone to hire them. The landowner's day becomes somewhat surprising when he goes out again at 9 a.m., and then at noon, and then again at 3 p.m., and finally again at 5 p.m., presumably looking for additional workers. I think we can assume that he has an idea of how many workers he needs, as this is his profession. So perhaps there weren't enough workers at 6 a.m. Perhaps he had to come back to look for more. It is interesting that he agrees upon a wage with the first workers, but the groups at 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., and 5 p.m., he simply stated that he would pay them whatever is right. The Greek word for right is diakaios, which can also be translated as just or righteous. And so as far as we can tell, the landowner is a good person and will be fair to his workers. Let us consider for a moment, then, the workers. We don't know if they are impoverished people or if this is their profession. We do know that culturally, this would not be an unusual way to acquire work. So the first group of workers agree with the owner to work for him for the day for the usual daily wage. In Greek, this is a denarius. Levine writes, our best estimate is that the Roman silver denarius would supply a family with 3 to 6 days of food. The payment was fair, but not exorbitant. Let's think about this initial wage for a moment. The workers have agreed to a specific amount. They could have argued for more, but in doing that, they might have risked not getting a job. Perhaps they had to take whatever they were offered. And the landowner could have offered less, perhaps knowing that someone would take the job with whatever he offered. Or perhaps he had to pay whatever it took to get the workers. But the important part, the part to pay attention to, is that they agreed on the amount. They were both willing to the balance between work done and payment promised. Around 9 a.m., the landowner returns to the marketplace where he finds others standing idle. We don't know why they were there. The Greek word translated here as idle is argos, but it can be translated a variety of ways. It may mean that they were lazy, that they should be doing something but aren't. But it can also be translated as free from labor, or, as Levine suggests, without work. If this is the case, then perhaps they wanted to work, but they were unable to get it. When the landowner comes, however, they are willing to work. And remember that they are willing to work without knowing exactly how much they will be paid. The text says the landowner would pay them whatever is right. The landowner comes to the market again at noon and 3 p.m., and he finds more workers each time. We don't know where they were the first times he came to the marketplace. Maybe they were working a different job. Perhaps they had already been hired that day, and that job only took half the day. Perhaps they had to take care of a sick family member. Or perhaps they just arrived in town, moving from a place where they were unable to obtain work. We don't know, but he hires each group, again with the promise of paying fairly. At 5 p.m., he returns again. And this is somewhat surprising. It is only an hour before the end of the day. To better understand this, we can look to Barclay, who describes the harvesting of a vineyard in his commentary. He writes that the grape harvest ripened towards the end of September, and then close on its heels, the rains came. If the harvest was not ingathered before the rains broke, then it was ruined. And so to get the harvest in was a frantic race against time. The landowner may have realized that the rains were coming, so even if the workers could only be there for an hour, it would be worth it so he wouldn't lose his produce. 6 o'clock comes, the end of the day, and it is time to pay the workers. The group that was hired at 5 p.m. comes and they receive a whole denarius. How thrilled they must have been to have been paid for a whole day after working for only an hour. Then the 3 p.m. group comes, the noon group, the 9 a.m. group. They, too, I think, would have been pleased with the amount they received, a full day's wage. Finally, the group that was hired initially come to receive their pay. They have worked for 12 long hours. I'm sure that they're tired and hot and ready to go home. They have seen the others receive a full day's pay, yet they have worked hours longer than any of these people. They think, surely we will receive more. They too receive a denarius. They have been paid exactly what they originally agreed upon, what they should have expected to receive. It is important to remember that the landowner has not cheated them, but they are not happy. They grumble about it. And they say to the landowner, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." And the landowner replies, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" The landowner begins his reply to them with the title "Friend." This sounds pleasant, but as Levine points out, Matthew's gospel only uses this 3 times, each of which is ironic in its use. He is annoyed, but he simply points out to them his generosity and that he has not cheated anyone. What are we to learn from this parable? Let's think first about the landowner. There are 2 primary ways to view the landowner. One is based on his initial wage agreement, and some people view him as the elite who are exploiting the poor. He is paying them, but perhaps not enough. And he is creating discontent among the workers, as we saw later in the parable. However, traditionally, the landowner is a symbol for God. We see this because, as Levine writes, the vineyard in the Jewish culture is the metaphor for God's property. We can point to verses such as Isaiah 5:7, where we read, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel." Or in John 15, where Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower." We see this symbol even more at the end of the parable. We must also consider the story from the worker's perspective. It depends upon who we identify with as to how we read the story. If we identify with the first hired, we may be sympathetic to them. The landowner could have given everyone more than they should have received, yet not equal amounts, while still paying the same total for the day. This perspective is not hard for us to identify with, I think. We are often uncomfortable to be content with others receiving more for less work. But let's also think from the perspective of the last hired. They didn't ask for extra. They were hired not even knowing how much they would receive. And they were grateful, I'm sure, for the amount given to them. If we identify with them, we can see that nobody has been harmed in the story, but some received extra. To really understand Jesus' meaning, however, we need to go back to the first phrase in the parable. Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner," and the story continues. An acceptable interpretation of this entire parable is that God is the landowner. And the parable is indicative of the kingdom of heaven because God is loving and generous and wants to welcome all people. But remember that the kingdom of heaven is not just what is to come. It is also what we want for this world. We turn once again to the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And so another acceptable reading of this is that the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner and the workers, because that is how we should be treating each other to bring God's kingdom here on earth. We should be generous to one another. The last hired may or may not have had another job that day. And so if they weren't hired and didn't receive the full day's wages, their families may not have been able to eat. Is it more just to receive based on the hours worked, or is it more just that all who worked were able to feed their families? Nobody was harmed by the landowner's actions. But for some, his generosity may have made a tremendous difference in their lives. Perhaps we are to see both. Perhaps as we read this text, we are to hear something about who God is and who we should be. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Amen.